This is a character animator head I've already made with a short bit of speech. I'm going to export this so that it's ready to be used in After Effects. A couple of things to note that I have changed in order to help this work more effectively. Over here in the Behaviours panel, I've twirled open the Face section and I have reduced the head position strength and the head scale strength to 0, and I've also reduced the head tilt strength down to about 10. This is so that the head doesn't move about too much or scale up and down, because it makes it look weird when it's on top of a static body if your head's going forwards and backwards. So by reducing those, the head stays pretty much where I tell it to, but still responds to my facial reactions. I'm going to export this as a movie file with alpha by choosing File, Export, Video with Alpha via Adobe Media Encoder. If you can't do this, use the PNG sequence and WAV. Both of these methods will export something that you can hide all of the background and just have the face showing. Video via Adobe Media Encoder won't allow this to happen. So I'm going to choose Video with Alpha via Adobe Media Encoder. First I need to give it a proper name and save it somewhere sensible. This has opened up Adobe Media Encoder, which shows in a list here the file that it's going to export and where to. So I just need to press play. Once it's completed rendering, I can move to Adobe After Effects. However, I am going to export it as a PNG sequence as well, so that I can show you how to use that method, just in case you need to. A very similar process is used to export the PNG sequence. I will choose File, Export, PNG sequence and WAV. It's sometimes a good idea to make a new folder to store all of your images in, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to call that My Head, and I'm just going to call each file My Head, and when it exports it, it will be exported as a series of images, all with the file name My Head followed by the number 001 or 2 and so on, as well as a WAV file for the sound. And there you can see all the files, including at the very end the audio file. Now I can work with this in After Effects. Here's the body I'm going to be using. If we take a look at the layers, you can see it's just a background and then this body that I've drawn quite quickly here. By using puppet pins in After Effects, we can make this 2D graphic, even though it's just one layer, move around as though it's got joints a bit like a person. So next we'll look at bringing these together in After Effects. So here I am in After Effects with a blank project with nothing in it. So first I need to import my assets. I will choose File, Import and File, and I'm going to bring in puppet pin body, and just before I bring it in I'm going to change the Import As setting to Composition Retain Layer Sizes. If you bring it in as footage, it comes in as a single layer, which means that the body and the background will be inextricably linked together. Using these composition options allows you to keep those layers separate and manipulate them separately. I'll press open. It will ask me pretty much the same question again, except with this time it may be that you've used layer styles, in which case you have an option to either merge them or keep them editable. In this case it doesn't matter, I haven't used them. And you'll see it brings in the layers from my Photoshop file, as well as creating a composition which I can open like this. And here you can see both of those layers being combined to produce this. Puppet pins. This is the puppet pin tool, and they're pretty simple to use once you get started. We place puppet pins where we want the joints of our character to be. We also might need to place them in areas that we want to be static. So for example, I could place one here. That in of itself will not do much because it has nothing to relate to. If I choose to place one here at the end of the arm, and then one up here where the neck would be, and then I move it, you'll see that to some degree it's doing what we expected. It's moving that arm and keeping the rest somewhat still. As soon as we put the other puppet pins in, the rest of the body will fall into place. So to do that, I will choose the elbow here and the hand here. I'll also choose to go down the legs as though it's hip, knee, foot, hip, knee and foot, and hopefully with just those pins it will give me enough to be able to move this model without having too many pins and making it too wobbly looking. As you can see, it's not quite working correctly. It's bringing this leg with it when I drag this puppet pin over here. We want the legs to work separately, like legs. So to make this better, we can have a look at the mesh. So up here, we can tick this box which says show, and you can see a triangular mesh surrounding your graphic. And if we look closely between the legs here, we can see that the mesh becomes one about halfway up the legs. So by reducing this expansion value, if I try down to 2 or -3, so the lower it is, the closer it will get to the center of the object that we're trying to use puppet pins on. So it seemed to be that if I put it at 0, pretty much okay there. It might be a different setting for yours, but either way, you need to adjust it until you're happy with the results, which you can see looking much better on this one. Having got my puppet pins in place, I can now animate them, and to do that is very straightforward. As soon as we've added a puppet pin, it's added a keyframe for them down in our timeline. Here under Effects and then Puppet, we now find Mesh 1. This is the mesh, and as part of Mesh 1 we have these deform puppet pins, and there's all the puppet pins that we've placed. So you can see 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and there we are. And as you can see, if I move the time indicator out of the way, there are already keyframes in place for each of those puppet pins starting position. If I leave that one open here and we move along, I'll just move along to a couple of seconds there, so it'll take time, it won't be very natural movement, but I can move these over here. It shows me the line of movement between the 2 points that we created, and now you can see that these 2 puppet pins have got additional keyframes added to them. And as I go back and forth, you can see the animation. And really it's about, going along. Hopefully you've planned out what your character's going to do, so you're not just doing lots of random movements, but it's quite fun to have a little play around with. I'll keep it very simple. I'll just remove these keyframes by pressing Command and Z, or Edit and Undo, or Control and Z, depending on what you're using. And 2 seconds is quite a long time for a leg to move a little bit like that. And at this point it might be helpful if we brought in our head. Now of course you don't have to use a character animator head like I am. You could simply just draw it as part of your graphic and have your character giving us a cheery wave. Next I'll bring in the character animator head by using the import options. Import file. I've got my MOV file called my head, which has got the alpha with it. I don't need to do anything here, I just press open. And because it's got the video with alpha, as soon as I put it into my composition, it doesn't show any of that background there, which makes it much easier just to composite into this. Now I might need to just move this around a little bit and perhaps scale the body. Don't worry, the puppet pins should go with it. Move that around a little, something like that. If you wanted to bring in your head as an image sequence, which is the alternative method, we can choose File, Import, File. Here's the folder I exported all the images to. And I'll go into there and I'll choose the first one, and here it's already ticked it, but if it hasn't, you can just tick PNG sequence and press open, And here you can see that's brought that in, and I can just pop that in my timeline, just as I did with the other one. I can resize it and do all the same things to it. To bring in the WAV, the audio file, import file, and right down at the bottom there, we have that WAV file, and you can just drag that in as the audio. Okay, and so I told my girlfriend. With the speech, I've got a little more idea of what sort of movement I could do, and so let's give him the starting position. As you can see, having done a few other things, I'm now using the selection tool. I can't see the puppet pins, so what I must do, make sure I'm on the correct layer, and just by clicking on the puppet pin tool, it should bring those back up. Do be careful when you are animating with puppet pins if you're doing it with the puppet pin tool, because it's very easy to accidentally add more puppet pins. So just be careful what you're selecting, and then it's what you want. So I'm happy with this as a starting position. You might notice if I overlap this hand and the body, the hand goes behind the back, whereas this one goes in front. You can alter whether it's in front or behind using the overlap tool, and here you can choose what percentage it is in front of the rest of the graphic. You can alter whether a particular pin appears above another or not using some of the other puppet pin tools, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail, but do have a look at those. Depending on which version of After Effects you're using, you will find either all the ones that are here or slightly fewer. In particular, the starch pin tool, which is used for keeping areas static, and the puppet overlap pin tool, which, as I said, you choose a particular pin, and then up here you choose what percentage it is to the front or to the back of your graphic. So you can go along and set those if you like. You would set the hand to a higher value than, down the body here, and it should then appear above the graphic. I'm not going to go into doing that. I'm going to do some quick animation. I'll just delete that. Go back to my puppet position tool and just move along the timeline. Now at the moment I've got quite a long timeline, much longer than I need, and so I'm going to zoom in a bit so I can see the seconds more clearly, and this is going to help me just animate my character a little to exactly what you're doing for your own purposes. Just move it a little bit, a little shuffle here and there. And then move it on a little, and move a little bit. You can be obviously a bit more precise. I'm just doing it to show you. And you can keep going like that, and as you can see, it just keeps adding those keyframes each time. So you can press space to watch your animation back. So I told my girlfriend. And make any adjustments as you need to. And you can keep going along like that until you're finished. Hopefully that's given you a good overview of the things you need to do in order to give your character animator heads an After Effects puppet pin body. Next I'm going to look at a bit of a variation. Instead of just having a single layer graphic that I'm using the puppet pins on, I'm going to put them on multiple layers. It works in almost exactly the same way. You just got to think a little bit more about what it is you're doing. For this tutorial, I'm going to animate multiple layers with puppet pins. And so, as you can see, I've created this rat squirrel, I'm not quite sure what it is, in Photoshop. The most important feature of this file is the multiple layers. You can see I've got the body, tail, back leg and front leg, all as separate layers, and the background as well. I'm going to bring this into After Effects and animate it using a combination of rotation and puppet pins. Here in After Effects, I'm going to import my file, import file. So I'll select my file here, and I will choose to import as a composition, retain layer sizes, and choose open. It's asked me again, but obviously with the editable styles here, but I can just press OK. And just as before, it's brought in the different layers of the Photoshop file and also created a composition that I can open by double clicking, and I can see all those different layers in there. First thing I need to do, because obviously at the moment it only has 2 legs, which for little animals can make travelling very difficult. So I'm going to duplicate the front and the back leg. I've selected both of those by pressing Shift, and I'm going to press Command D or Control D. You could also choose Edit and Duplicate. I'm just going to offset the front leg a little by moving it to the left using the arrow key. And you can see that this is appearing above the body here, so I need to just move that and put it below the body. Same with the back leg here. I'll move that a little to the left using the arrow key, and then bring that behind the body as well. So just in the same way that Photoshop works, whichever is lowest is furthest back as we see it. The next thing that we need to do for this character to move correctly is alter the point of origin for each of the layers. So as you can see, if I rotate this leg here, so I get the rotation tool from the top and I rotate the leg, you can see it spins around its middle, whereas we want it to spin from where the hip would be. This tool up here, the pan behind tool or the anchor point tool, allows us to move that point to the right location. So I can choose that, and then when I go back to rotation, you can see that when I move this, it swings in the right sort of way. I need to do that to each of my layers. So using that pan behind tool, I can go down here, front leg, and I'll just move it up here to the shoulder, back leg, up like that. Obviously you get to decide where your limbs rotate around. So the tail obviously is going to rotate around here at the bottom of the body. Body is fine, and this front leg needs to be up here, and that back leg is the one I did before, so that's all in place now. One more thing you can do whilst you're here is parenting. If you plan on having your creature move around a bit, it might pay off to parent it. Parenting is a way of setting up a hierarchy between the different objects in the scene if they're linked. So for example, if I move the body, so I'll just use the normal selection tool. If I move the body, at the moment it flies off and leaves everything else behind. However, normally we take our arms and legs with us when we move around. So I'm going to attach the front leg to the body, and to do that, here in the parent and link column, you can click on this little thing called the pick whip and drag it to the layer that you want to parent it to. So in this case, the front leg will be parented to the body. That is, wherever the body goes, the front leg now goes. The front leg can move on its own, so I could have this in lots of different positions, but the body is still in control of where the limb goes. And you may wish to do that to each of your limbs. So the back leg will go to the body, the tail to the body, the front leg to the body, and the back leg to the body. Obviously we don't want to parent anything to the background because that stays where it is. The body of course doesn't have a parent because that's the thing that you're going to move to control the position of your character should you want to. So the idea behind this method, as opposed to a single graphic, is that we can, for example, control the rotation of the tail. I will twirl open the tail layer and twirl, open, transform, and here we can see the different things that we can keyframe, one of which is the rotation, and I might have the tail wag, something like that. So ordinarily I could click the stopwatch, put the tail into its starting position and move the timeline indicator and move the tail to a new position, and it keyframes it. So I then get this movement, but of course you might want to add a little bit of flair, a little bit of detail to it, and particularly when it comes to legs you might want the feet to sort of flick or do an additional bit of animation to create the sense of movement. So puppet pins allow us to do that. I'll start with the tail here, and making sure I'm on the tail layer, I'm going to, and also I'm just going to make sure that my timeline indicator is right at the start here, because it's quite easy for this to become quite confusing, I suppose. I'll choose the puppet pin tool, and I'm going to place puppet pins where I normally would. One at the base of the tail, and in this case I might use a few just to give it some more flexibility. And so here it is in the starting position, so I might choose to curl it a little further, perhaps just extend that curl, something like that. And if I go along to its next position, you can see the puppet pins go with it. So the rotation is happening, but we're just going to use the puppet pins to add a little bit more movement to it. So here we are in that next position. I might perhaps just move it out a little bit, something like that. And then you should be able to see not only is the tail rotating, but the puppet pins are giving it a slightly new shape as well. We could do the same for a leg. So if I choose this back leg, I can puppet pin. So I've chosen the layer, back leg. I can puppet pin right there on the anchor point. Somewhere down where it would have its knee, its ankle, and then at the end of the foot, something like that. So I've got a good bit of movement in there. And again, I can open the transform properties, so I can just tuck up effects. So I'll just twirl that up so I can see what I'm doing. Twirl, open, transform. Turn the stopwatch on to keyframe the rotation, and I can either use the tools down here or the tools at the toolbar. I'm just going to bring that leg forward perhaps. Having keyframed the rotation, you can see the puppet pins have disappeared for me. An easy way to get this back is just to twirl open effects and have puppet available. If I click that, you can see they're all visible again. And so I could perhaps, stretch the foot out a bit more as though it's reaching out, something like that. And then as we come along the timeline, I can rotate that leg back again like this, something like that. And at this point I might choose to use the puppet pins to flick the foot out backwards, something like that. And we can see that changes the shape as it goes along. We could of course put intermediary bits here where the pin is in another new position. So it's a good idea to get the rotation kind of sorted and then perhaps add the flourish with the pins afterwards. And once you do that to all of your limbs, you'll have some sort of fantastic looking creature that moves in a really interesting way. So now that you know how to do it, have a go yourself and go and make some exciting things with puppet pins.